Tonight's sponsor of the year or the yurtzeit plaques is Goldie Basworth Galda Bas Elazar. The ground in this week's parsha of Korach swallowed up Korach and his followers. The question is, why did they die specifically that way? There's no such thing as coincidence. Why did they die specifically that way? Everything was swallowed into the ground. So the Sefer Ituri Torah, he quotes the following Gemara in Chulin. The Gemara says on Peites, Amar Rabbi Elai, Eino Elam es kayim ela b'shvi mishe boilim es atzmo b'shas meriva. The entire world endures because someone closes his mouth during a quarrel, during a fight. That's why the entire world continues to exist. Amazing concept. Shnemar, the Gemara quotes a pasuk over there. Now, not only does Korach and his followers not keep their mouth shut, but additionally, they had a different problem. They instigated an argument over here. They lit and tried to spread a very negative fire and a dangerous fire. And therefore, Mida Keneged Mida, they got in trouble, measure for measure. In other words, they caused a lot of trouble with what? It was through their mouth. And therefore, they got punished by another mouth, aka the ground. It opened up its mouth, swallowed them all up. See you later. That's the idea over here. They spoke negative, derogatory, lashon hara information about Moshe, and therefore that's why they got punished that way. That's one answer. There's another interesting twist of a midah keneged midah over here, of the ground following them up in a different way, a measure for measure situation over here. Korach and his group questioned the validity of Moshe. And they thought everyone should be a leader. Everyone. But what does the pasuk say by Moshe? V'ha'ish Moshe onov miod mekol ha'odom asher al pnei ha'adama. Moshe was more humble than what? Anyone where? On the Adama, the ground. Literally, everyone who lived on the ground. Ground, flat surface, plateau, symbolizes humility. A desert. Also, we discussed in Parshas Bamidbar exactly. The desert is humility. Lowliness. So therefore, when the pasuk specified that Moshe was more humble than anyone on the ground, it was symbolizing this idea. But Korach, they said they disregarded the humility. It was insignificant in their eyes. They belittled humility, aka the ground. That's what the ground represents. And therefore, they were punished by being swallowed by the ground. Second answer, interesting twist. It says in the Derech Eretz Rabbah, in Perech Yud Aleph, you have Mesechtes Ketanos at the end of Seder Nezikin, and one of them is Derech Eretz Rabbah Zuta. So it says over there, someone who is arrogant is as if he worshipped idolatry. The truth is in the Gemara also, in Shabbos Kuftal, many places. The Ramah says a very interesting halacha in Simin Kuf Samach Zayin, Sif Yudal, in the halachas of B'tzias Apas, cutting bread. And he says that prior to someone, the Mavarech, saying a bracha, before someone says Hamotzi, when we say a bracha of Hamotzi, we have company over on Shabbos. Ma says that we should say, Breshus Moirav Rabboisai. Should say, I'm asking permission from my rabbis, from my masters. Moirav Rabbosa, my masters and my rabbis. So, specified over there, it's as if he's asking permission. The Mishnah Brew over there explains Sifkatan Ayin Hey. Even if he's the greatest one there, he should still say this. Why? Because humility is very important. Demonstrating that others are greater than us. And the Or Zarua over there explains, that by someone doing this in Chelek Aleph and Simin Kuf Ayin Ches, the Or Zarua explains he's essentially informing everyone else that he's not the most important person there. This will automatically increase his humility. That's why there's a custom to do so. It says in the Mishnah in Avos, I'm going to now digress to something else about Korach. There's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos about Korach in the 5th parak. Mishnah says, and a lot to discuss in this Mishnah, but one specific point. Kol machloike shehi l'shem shamayim soifel l'eskayim. V'she'ena l'shem shamayim ein soifel l'eskayim. Any argument which is for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim, will endure. But any argument which is not, it won't last. What's an argument that's for the sake of heaven? Hil v'shamay. When Hillel and Shammai argued, that was for the sake of heaven. At last, we still learn about their arguments every single day. Machlokes. Actually, there's an interesting Taisus in Chagiga, and if I'm not mistaken, Yudal and Alf that discusses the first machlokes was based on because the Talmidim of Shammai and Hill didn't serve them properly. Side point, and nothing to do with this. V'she'ena l'shem shemayim zo machlokes Korach v'kol adasa. And what's a machlokes? An argument that isn't for the sake of heaven. That's Korach and his followers and his group. Let's just focus on one point over here. The Reisha of the Mishnah, the beginning part, said what? Hillel and Shammai. That's for the sake of heaven. The later part of the Mishnah said what? Korach v'odasa. What didn't it say? Moshe didn't bring both parties. Where'd they go? Where'd Moshe go? Good question, right? So the Barbanel already picks up on this in his Nachlas Avos, and he says that when you argue with your rabbi, that's not even an argument. A student, a Talmud, is so far removed from his Rebbe, there's nothing to even argue about. You got a guy over here who's a beginner, he's trying to argue with someone who's advanced. It's not even a shiloh over here. It's not even called an argument. So therefore, you couldn't even list them. You couldn't even list Korach and Moshe together. If you would have done that, you would have been equating them, so to say. But Hillel and Shammai, that's something to talk about. Answer number 2, the Medrash Shmuel. Moshe's argument was l'shma. It's for the sake of heaven. Shem Shemayim. So you can't put something which is for the sake of heaven with something which isn't for the sake of heaven. A.K. Moshe and Korach. That's answer number 2. Answer number 3, then a little day me, says the Mishnah's alluding to Korach was even arguing with his own followers. So you put them together, Korach v'adasa. Now, the question that we need to deal with over here is keeping one's mouth shut, like the Gemara in Chulin said above, is that so great and so important that the whole world exists because of that? What's the explanation of the Gemara in Chulin? So the Ein Yaakov answers this by quoting another Gemara. The Gemara in Sanhedrin on Zayin Amar Aleph says, Omar Rav Huna hay tigro dam yilisinuro tebid kodamayo kevan derovach ravach. A quarrel, an argument is comparable to a hole in the dam. That's the type of holy you don't want to be. And what happens? Once it starts opening, it starts opening. What's going to happen? You got a little hole. Oh, no problem, a little crack. But guess what? Before you know it, the whole thing comes down. Tremendous damage it could cause. It's the same thing with arguments. They start small, but it could spiral into something very bad. We all know this past year was a year filled with fires. Filled. You got the California situation. We had the Israel situation. You had in New Jersey, not as bad, but the fires everywhere. Amazing with all the technological advancements, self-driving cars, everything that we have nowadays. You could get from one place of the world to another in less than a day or a day. Amazing space, this. They can't even put out a fire. Because once it gets too big, even nowadays, it's hard to put out. It's the same thing with an argument with a machloikis. Once the argument gets out of hand, a lot of times it could be irreparable damages. That's what we need to be very careful with that. The Ramchal in his Mesilas Yesharim in Perek Yoda Aleph explains this Gemara in Chulin is referring to someone who is angry, but he overcame his anger and kept quiet in an argument. For him, the world continues to exist. That's how the Ramchal learns this Gemara. The Vilna Gaon says, Al kol rego v'rego. If you want to know where the source of this is, it's in the Igros Hagra. He says, Al kol rego v'rego sha'odam chaysim piv. For every single second that a person keeps his mouth quiet when he really wants to just argue back, he will merit the special hidden light that is impossible for any angel or even creation on this world to even fathom what that is. To even start to assess that. The Maharal explains a beautiful analogy when it comes to this in the Siva Shalom in Parakal, page 2, 18, the one that I have. He says that if you try to rip clothing, like this jacket, you try to rip it, it's pretty difficult. Unless you have a strategy, you're very strong. But guess what? Once there's already a small tear, pretty easy to rip. Same thing with machlokes. Once you get the ball rolling, it's all downhill from there in a bad way. And therefore, same idea. It's a very interesting idea when it comes to arguments. The Ben Ish Chai, this is in the Ben Yehoyada and Chulin on Pei Tes. He quotes an interesting Alshach. The pasuk says back in Bereshis in Yud Gimel, in Zion and Ches, there was a riv, a quarrel between the shepherds of Lod and Avram. The pasuk continues, Vayomer Avram el Lod al notim miriva. He said there shouldn't be meriva. There shouldn't be a quarrel. You went from riv to meriva. What's the difference and why? Interesting question that probably no one would think of. Then Ish Chai thought of it. The Alshach thought of it. What's the idea over here? The word riv is in Lashon Zachar. What does that have to do? It's only men are fighting? What does that mean? Meriva is only feminine. So what does that mean? As we know, we can't have children. Women could, right? Originally, there was one argument. But as time went on, one led to another and another. It gave birth. This coincides beautifully with the Stipler in his Birchas Peretz back in Parshas Vayera. According to the opinion who holds that the Makkah of Svardeya, right? Let's go back to Egypt. They had a frog, right? How did it start? Two different opinions. According to the opinion who says there was one frog, they kept hitting the frog and then more frogs came. Why would they keep hitting it? Hence, there's a Stipler, because once you get upset, you can't even control your emotions. It just gets out of hand. It's a negative spiral effect. It's the same exact idea over here. It's illogical. The anger, the argument, it just overtakes a person. That's the idea. It explains two different types of arguments. One, you could end it, but one keeps going. It keeps giving birth. So what then should we do if hypothetically we were ever in the case that we would have an argument with someone and it wouldn't be a good type of argument? So it's brought in the Sefer Halichas Bein Adam Lechavero, page 121. Rav Fuchs explains, it's very simple. Just keep silent. In fact, he says if insulting words were said, someone threw words out that you didn't like to hear, no problem. Just don't say anything back. Wait for the person to cool off. Later on, when everyone's calm, you could go back. Later on, you could peacefully and maturely express your opinion. That's a very important idea. The truth is, it seems like this is an explicit Mishnah. The Mishnah in Avos says, in the fourth parak, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer al terotzes chaverchu b'shas kasel. Gemara also mentioned, don't try to appease your friend when he's angry. When someone's angry, they're not in a regular state. It's like when a person's drunk almost. Middle of an argument, when someone's angry, leave it, come back later. Be a totally different result. Rabbi Eliezer Papa also discusses this in his Pella Yoyetz in Erech Avos Ish v'Isha. He discusses this point as well. If quarrel happened between spouses, wait a day or two before you respond. There's a story with the Chafetz Chaim towards the end of his life, and they wanted to establish basically a second Chever Kadisha to compete with the existing one, and it was causing a lot of tension, and there was an argument erupting. Chafetz Chaim said, I have to intervene with this. On Shabbos morning, he addressed the congregation in Radin's main shul. And he said the following, my precious brothers, even if you would have given me millions of dollars to come here, I'm not interested. I wouldn't have agreed. I'm old. Every single moment is incredibly precious to me. I don't need all the money in the world. Nevertheless, he says, I recognize the urgency of this matter. I have no choice but to come here today and address you publicly. I've been in the town of Radin for 50 years, said the Chafetz Chaim. All of us will be eventually taken to the grave. And we're going to have to answer for what we did and our words that we said in this world. And he said, says the Chafetz Chaim, an argument is a very serious matter. Even if a person performed mitzvahs his entire life, it could all get destroyed because he was involved with a dispute. And he said, should this conflict continue to rage, I'm confident that once you appear before the heavenly court, you will desperately seek to save yourself from divine punishment. And you're no doubt, you're going to say, there was a Jew in Radin, a holy Jew by the name of Yisrael Meir. He was regarded as a big Talmud Chacham, as a holy person. He saw the whole episode of the argument unfold and he said nothing. Says the Chafetz Chaim, I therefore appear and appeal to you that when the day of reckoning arrives, do not associate my name with this quarrel. That's the idea. Perhaps this is also based on the Gemara in Shabbos on Nun Daled, that when public figure who could say something and doesn't say something, he's held accountable for the actions. He burst into tears, the Chafetz Chaim, and his entire body began to quiver and tremble in fear. And his message resonated loud and clear to the people of Radin. The new Chevra Kadisha was abandoned, and peace once again returned to the Chafetz Chaim's hometown. I saw this in the Great Jewish Speeches, pages 54 to 55. Beautiful story. Lastly, and we'll conclude with this, we have to be very careful not to quarrel on Shabbos. The pasuk says, "Lo yisevaru eish b'chol moish v'oseichem b'yom haShabbos." Don't make a fire in your house on the whole Shabbos. This is the one halacha in Parshas Vayakel that is singled out that you shouldn't do on Shabbos, specifically over here. Why this one? There's a lot of answers to this question. One answer is, my great-great-grandfather already talks about this in his Sefer Nachal Asvi. Shabbos is a time when we all gather together. All the electronics are off. We're all together. It's a time where there could be lashon hara, arguments, fights that could surface. The pasuk is saying, get the fire out of there, like we discussed before the forest fire comes too big. This is one of the reasons why we cover the challah on Shabbos, not to embarrass it. Not to embarrass the challah that the bracha of hamotzi comes before hagefen, even though it's an inanimate object. If we're so worried about the embarrassment of just food, then for sure an actual object over here we have to be careful about. Everyone should have a wonderful night. But Rabbi Chanan ben Kashamer Ratzah Kadosh Baruch Hu Zachas says Israel Lefikach Yirblem Torah Mitzvah Shneim Anay Chafetz Man Siko Yagdil Travi